Prior to coming to BYU, Idaho, I worked for the state of Alaska for a number of years, more recently as a fisheries economist. And today I'll talk about some of the research, one of the projects that I did. And I did this project initially, and then every time when I looked at every time this regulation came up, I did sort of a similar analysis on it. And, but for today's presentation, I'll give you a brief overview of Alaska's salmon commercial fisheries, and I'll talk about a little bit about the regulatory process and then about the research that I did and the conclusions that I came to. First of all, looking at the history of the commercial exploitation of salmon in Alaska had been documented as far back as 1878. Salmon's a normal good. As GDP per capita in the United States has increased, so has the appetite for commercial for salmon. And not only in the United States, but also in the world, technological innovations have allowed for increased harvest of salmon. And we can see that with as these numbers start to increase. A few things about this data that might be a little bit suspect. This data only includes Alaskan harvest of salmon, and it doesn't include harvest by the foreign fishing fleet. There have been, for a while, the U.S. jurisdiction outside of the from the shoreline only extended something like maybe about a dozen or so miles until the 1970s. And so all the foreign fishing harvest is not accounted for in any of this data. Prior to statehood, a lot of the salmon fisheries were managed by the feds. It actually, by proxy, mostly the canneries managed that. If they wanted to harvest a whole bunch of salmon, they did. And that led to some of these declines in what was able to be harvested, in addition to the foreign salmon fleet pulling out, extracting the salmon. The canneries they started to exclude the local Alaskans from being able to participate in the fishery. Enough of them got upset, and because of salmon, they pushed for statehood, which happened in January of 1959. Right about here, that was the beginning of state management of Alaskan fisheries. With that, Alaska was the very first state to have a natural history clause in the state constitution. Since then, other states have amended their constitution to include something about natural history or natural resources. In Article 8 of the state constitution, there's a couple of important things that it talks about. One is that natural resources are to be used for maximum sustained use. And that's one aspect. Another is the idea of it there being an open access fishery. Anybody can enter into that fishery. The efforts to manage their fisheries were seen as being insufficient, such that the state constitution was amended again in the 1970s, and the Limited Entry Act was passed, which in effect limited the number of participants that could participate in any given fishery. So within a geographic area for a specific species, using a gear that created different fisheries, and only a set number of participants could participate in the fishery. That was one important thing that happened in the 1970s. Another was the phenomena of global cooling, which with cooler waters allowed for higher productivity of salmon. And the third thing that's really important, Magnuson-Stevenson Act was passed, which has a whole bunch of provisions in there. One of those extended the statewide jurisdiction from, I can't remember if it was 12 or 20 miles, not very far off the shore, but extended the national jurisdiction of the United States out to 200 nautical miles. And for a species like salmon, this is really important. Salmon will be out in the open ocean right before they spawn. They aggregate closer to the shoreline before they hit the streams to go upriver or upstream to be able to spawn and reproduce. So a lot of the harvest happens not very far from shore. So these three things allowed for increased productivity of salmon. Now, I want to talk about something else too that's important to this project that I did. If we look at the historical harvest of salmon among any type of a fishery in Alaska, most of the time you'll generally see a trend that looks like this. The red line shows the average real earnings. In the 1970s, when we see the increased available harvest of salmon because there's more productivity, more access to the fishery by those in Alaska harvesting salmon, the values went up, and for a couple of reasons. One is there was a greater supply of fish. Another is that about that time, the fisheries crashed in the west coast of the United States, in Oregon and Washington, California. It happened because of, uh, let's see, because of agriculture, which reduced habitat, and through overfishing. And the third one being dams. Had all those things have had their effect. The first two of those, I think, give a clear explanation as why the salmon fisheries on the East Coast crashed a long time ago. But with that, Alaska ended up increasing the market power of salmon. More than half the world's production of salmon came from Alaska. With these higher prices, though, that also meant that it was more financially feasible to start salmon aquaculture production places in places like Chile and Scandinavia. And we've seen exponential growth of salmon aquaculture in those areas. With that growth of salmon, there's this general decline of the value of the Alaskan fisheries, which finally reached its nadir around 2002. Since then, there have been some structural changes to the Alaskan fisheries. Right now, if you go to Bristol Bay, you notice the value has increased. A large measure that has to do with the quality of salmon. They started. You see a transition of moving away from canned salmon products to more fillet. There's very few canned canneries anymore. Most of the salmon that comes out of Alaska are frozen fish fillet. Some species like pink salmon, you'll still see a lot of canned salmon, but for the higher quality salmon, such as sockeye or king salmon or coho salmon, those are usually done through fillets. And also, when fishermen harvest their salmon, they put them in these refrigerated seawater systems, which hasn't, that type of technology hasn't been around for all that long. Or even with the shore-based fisheries, such as set gillnet, they'll chill them on ice, they'll put them in, icing is kind of a big deal now. But all these different measures to increase the quality of fish. But we go back to 2002, when we're at the low point. There, all these ideas were being floated around and discussed as to how to try to save these fisheries, because there was a concern that maybe these fisheries would go away. They didn't quite seem as viable as they were previously. And one idea came is that in an area that's depressed, you could allow one person to hold two permits. And they couldn't do anything with the second permit, but they could at least hold on to the two permits. When the Limited Entry Act was passed, only one person could hold a permit. That way you didn't have too much market power with one person. To kind of help with the open access idea of the fishery. But in 2002, there's a statute put into place that said permit holders can hold two permits, but they can't do anything with the second permit. A few years later, somebody else, another lawmaker, came in and amended that statute and said, okay, the Board of Fisheries can decide what happens with that second permit. Alaska has this regulatory process wherein anybody can propose a new regulation, a new rule to fishing, and a 7-member of a board, which has been appointed by the governor, they have to be confirmed by the legislator, can pass this regulation, this proposal around. There's a huge public process that they have to go through, and each fishery goes through this process every 3 years, so that the regulation's not super permanent, but you have enough time to figure out what's going on. And with that, there were a couple of areas that passed the permit stacking regulations. Permit stacking is when one person has two permits, can double the amount of gear that they have. So, like for example, in Bristol Bay, one permit allows a permit holder to put a gill net 50 fathoms, which comes out to about 300 feet out, and to catch fish. A gill net has these mesh, they basically holes in the net that when the fish go through, their gills get entangled into the net. By having, if you can stack, you can extend your nets out twice as far. And that also catches a bunch of the fish that are going through, but that your neighbors otherwise would catch. So it can be a little controversial. The report that I did, I put some pictures that I had that were all stacked up. The top one, the bottom two were ones from my personal collection. That's actually me in a boat in a set gillnet fishery. There's two ways to harvest fish. One is you get in a little boat and you go back and forth along the net, picking the fish out of it. The other way is if you have huge tidal swings, you put your net out. When the tide goes out, you can go and pick the fish out of the net, like you can see in the bottom picture. That picture came from a biologist and an aerial photo that he took while observing the fishery in Bristol Bay. So I put together this report using some data techniques that I was able to learn when I worked at Office of Children's Services. And there's a few things that I have in this report that I think would be worth mentioning. The first one is looking at the participation. At this point, I had to sort of estimate 2012. And if you go to the appendix, I have this explanation as to what I did to estimate the participation for this last year. But it turns out that at least the predictions that I did were really close to what actually happened. So it was worth keeping at least for the presentation. So one of the concerns about these regulations that they were hoping to benefit, especially locals, that can be kind of a tricky political objective to satisfy, because according to court precedent in Alaska, the regulations or statutes cannot favor people by race or where they live. That's very different from the way the feds manage things. The feds they can legally discriminate people by their race or by where they live, but the state can't. And so they kind of have to tiptoe around how they pass these regulations. And one of some of the big drivers of this regulation asserted that this regulation would especially help the locals, but for whatever reason, local participation actually it was fairly low, and it decreased through time in Bristol Bay. I'm not sure entirely why that is. I have a few hypotheses, but that didn't quite satisfy that argument very well. Another thing is, when you look at earnings, those who had stack permit operations tended to earn more than double individuals who were in single permit operations. You can see that here in 2010, stack permit operations on average had about $106,000 of fish ticket receipts. The single permit operations were 44,000, less than half that. And you see that consistently each year in this fishery and in other fisheries as well. So that was another concern, is that because in these type of fisheries are what's called fully allocated. There's a set number of fish that are going to be harvested. Everybody who has a permit are basically fighting for a piece of that pie. It's a zero-sum game. So if one person starts harvesting more fish, then that means another person can't harvest another fish. And the idea with limited entry is that everybody has equal access to the fishery. And so there were some concerns that those with two permits would have an advantage. I think in some degree it makes sense. What's the opportunity cost of having two permits or not? If you're somebody who is a little bit more aggressive in how you fish, and it might be more worth it to catch more fish, of course you'll want to buy that second permit, and of course you'll be making more than double of what everybody else is with that types of opportunity cost. But that was one of the results that was manifested with this type of data that we had. And this table shows the distribution of earnings. I guess I'll skip over this. I thought that was interesting, but it wasn't a huge part of the discussion of what during the Board of Fisheries meetings. Another aspect of concern is that the number of new entrants into the fishery went down while the regulation was put into place. Here's some data that more recently came out, but it shows this historical data, which allows us to contrast those 3 years along with other years. Among the three lowest years were the years when the permit stacking regulation was put into effect. And I think part of that is because those who wanted to fish a second permit, they were the ones who had an increased desire to purchase that second permit, and which made it harder for other people who were trying to just get into the fishery to be able to start up. So that was another concern. I did a little bit of modeling, and it found that, at least according to this model, that the permit value increased as a result of permit stacking. I ran a regression, had a dummy variable for this regulation, the years when this regulation was put into place. At least according to the model, permit value went up about 15,000. And interestingly enough, after the regulation sunset, it ended up not being renewed. Permit value did go down. And those were the big concerns. Were the lack of local permit holder participation The fact that people with stacked permit operations had at least a perceived higher opportunity to harvest fish. It gave them an extra advantage over those who didn't have stacked permits. And there was concerns about the number of new entrants entering the fishery and the permit value going up. Now, these same issues were manifest in the Kodiak fishery as well, which has a somewhat higher proportion of non-residents participating in the fishery and non-locals. And so those regulations sunset. In other fisheries, like in Cook Inlet, the set gill net and the drift gill net fishery, which has a very high local participation rate. Most of the permit holders in Cook Inlet live in Anchorage, which is Cook Inlet's their backyard. And those issues at least weren't of concern. And so those regulations are still into effect today. We're having stacked permit operations. There's one more fishery in Yakutat that they allow for permit stacking, but nobody there ever really does it. The only reason why it was passed there is there was a commercial fisherman from Bristol Bay. He couldn't vote on the issues in Bristol Bay because that's where he fished. But he really wanted there to be a lot of stacked operations, and so he pushed to have this regulation passed in Yakutat that nobody really cared about. Well, anyways, there's some of the work that I did regarding an issue in Alaskan commercial fisheries. I hope you're able to learn at least a little bit about Alaskan fisheries and some of the things that you can do with economics in here. Thank you for your time and attention in this matter.